Des Salts de Marie. He forced white men to gaze on the rugged beauty of the place where the waters of Lake Superior cascade to the lower level of Huron, and the other lakes were probably members of the exploratory party of Etienne Brulé, whom Champlain had commissioned to find an open waterway leading to the Western Ocean. They landed there sometime in 1618 and named the leaping waters Sault de Gaston, in honor of the French monarch's brother. But since Brule left no records of his trip, and the only knowledge we have of his discoveries is from hearsay, the credit for discovering the rapids, which bear the name of the Virgin Mary, must be given to another protégé of Champlain, the adventurous Jean Nicolet. He was a mere stripling just arrived from Old France when he became Champlain's choice as leader of a new expedition to find the elusive Northwest Passage. He prepared himself for the arduous task by a long apprenticeship among the savages of New France. Undergoing such fatigues as none but eyewitnesses can conceive, he often passed 7 or 8 days without food, and once full 7 weeks with only bark from the trees for nourishment. Brule set out from Quebec in the spring of 1634 for Georgian Bay on Lake Huron and, as he believed, the city of Peking. So optimistic was he as to the success of his quest that he took a gorgeous brocaded robe of China silk with him to wear at his first audience before the Great Khan. But his high hopes were doomed to disappointment, for he did not find the passage he sought. Instead, he discovered Lake Michigan. The skin-clad savages who lived on its western shore in what eventually became the territory and state of Wisconsin gave him a hospitable reception. According to his official chronicler, Father Vimont, he even had an opportunity to wear his silk robe. The priest writes, "They meet him, they escort him, and carry all his baggage." He wore a grand robe of China damask, all strewn with flowers and birds of many colors. No sooner did they perceive him than the women and children fled at the sight of a man who carried thunder in both hands. For this they called the 2 pistols that he held. 2. However, it was not until 1641 that the first missionaries visited the site and renamed it Sault Ste. Marie, the name by which it is known even today. These missionaries were the Jesuits Charles Rainbow and Isaac Jogues, who made the journey to the Sault purely for reconnoitering purposes. The number of priests in New France was still insufficient to allow further expansion of their work. The Jesuit superior in residence at Quebec had imposed upon his subjects the inflexible rule that they must convert the Indian nations dwelling nearby before tackling those farther away. His men scrupulously obeyed this order, but it did not deter them from looking over the situation for future possibilities. Rainbow and Jogues were returning from the Huron country when envoys from the friendly Chippewas invited them to address a gathering of their people at the outlet of Lake Superior. The Jesuits had just witnessed the pagan rites celebrated by the Hurons and their allies to commemorate the Feast of the Dead. This was an event which took place once every 8 or 10 years. The bones of the dead, who had been wrapped in bark and laid on scaffolds in the Huron Oigase, or cemetery, were taken down, stripped of any flesh that might remain, covered with fine furs, and placed in a common grave which was also lined with furs. These common graves, some of them circular, others rectangular, are the bone pits frequently discovered by farmers plowing fields, which happen to be near the sites of ancient Huron and Iroquois villages. The Jesuit missionaries found more than 2,000 savages assembled at the rapids, waiting to hear their message. Fewer than 1/10 of these lived in that region, the overwhelming majority having come from long distances. Rainbow and Jogues did not attempt, under the circumstances, the laying of any permanent missionary foundation. They preached a sermon to the attentive throng before returning to their mission house, and erected a large cross on the bank of St. Mary's River as a remembrance of their visit. Hardly less thrilling to the missionaries than the sight of this huge concourse of Indians was their first view of the tumbling waters of Le Lac Supérieur, as the French explorers called the largest of the Great Lakes. As they gazed on the rapids, they were struck with awe and could only exclaim, "Sault," adding reverently, "Sainte Marie," to indicate that only the lovely name of the Mother of God should ever grace this beautiful spot. From then until the beginning of the 18th century, the history of Sault Ste. Marie is largely the history of Jesuit missionary endeavor. The cursory visit of Rainbow and Jogues opened the way for other Jesuits who came first to look the place over and eventually to establish a residence there. John Gilmary Shea, who made a special study of Catholic missionary work among the North American Indians, writes with unconcealed admiration of the exploits of the Black Robes. He singles out in particular René Menard, who came to the Sault in the early part of October 1660. Shea observes, "There is something grand and sublime in the heroism of these early missionaries, which rises as we contemplate it. And few will win our admiration more than Menard, a man devoid of enthusiasm, whose letters are as calm and unimpassioned as those of a commercial house, yet one who, in his vocation and in the appointment of his superiors, saw the will of God and did it manfully. Menard was a fellow laborer in that glorious company of Jesuits, Brebeuf, Jogues, Bressani, Garnier, Garot, and others who won martyrs' crowns in the New World. Unlike them, however, he was not called upon to shed his blood in witness of his faith, though every fiber of his being cried for that fate. Time and again he seemed to be on the very threshold of attaining his desire, only to have the palm of victory snatched from him. In 1660, a new opportunity presented itself when 60 canoes manned by Algonquin warriors and loaded with furs appeared at Quebec. As they were preparing to return to their village far to the west, they asked for a black robe to accompany them. For years, the Jesuits had entertained hopes of establishing a mission on Lake Superior, but their several attempts had ended in failure. Now, when they were sought after, there were few men who could be spared for the purpose. However, the Jesuit superior, Father Jerome Lalemant, would not refuse the request without making some effort to fulfill it. He offered the post to the aged Menard, who was living in retirement at Quebec. This warrior of Christ gratefully received the obedience of his superior, despite the fact that his head was whitened with years, his face scarred with wounds received in the streets of Cayuga, for he had been one of the first to bear the faith into central New York. Thoroughly inured to Indian life, with many a dialect of Huron and Algonquin at his command, René Menard sought to die, as his earlier friends and comrades had long since done. The West seemed a promised land, to be reached only through the Red Sea of his own blood, and with joy he received the order to begin his march into the wilderness. We have still extant a letter written by him in August 1660 on leaving Three Rivers, replete with a spirit of sacrifice which can scarce find a parallel. He went destitute and alone, broken with age and toil, but with a life which he saw could last only a few months, yet he had no thought of recoiling. It was the work of Providence, and in utter want of all the necessaries of life, he exclaims, "He who feeds the young raven and clothes the lily of the field will take care of his servants." And should we at last die of misery, how great our happiness would be. This was the swan song of a spiritual giant. A year later he would meet his death. In the interval, he endured many trials and intense suffering. Journeying with the Ottawas to the west, he was forced to paddle from morning to night, to shoulder a pack far beyond his feeble strength at the numerous portages. He suffered without complaint the pangs of hunger. Even the consolation of saying the divine office during the odd moments he was left to himself was denied him, for the heartless savages mockingly snatched his breviary and flung it into the river. When finally he reached the Indian village, he was more dead than alive, yet his dauntless spirit could not be discouraged. "Here I had the consolation of saying Mass," he wrote to his superior in Quebec, "which repaid me with usury for all my past hardships." Menard died at the hands of savages in some part of the wilderness known only to God. It was a brave and glorious end, even though it is not called a martyr's death according to the rigid standards imposed by the Church. The death of René Menard did not bring to a close Jesuit missionary activity on Lake Superior. A few years later, Claude Allouez reached the southern shore of this great inland sea. He established flourishing missions among the Ottawas and Chippewas, the Hurons and Nipissings. He passed the Sault on his way to Lake Superior and saw at once the advantage of locating a mission where many tribes of Indians were in the habit of gathering either to escape their enemies or to fish in the rich waters. 2 years later, when he returned to Quebec to report to his superior, he recommended that this mission be established. The youthful father, Jacques Marquette, was dispatched to Sault-Ste. Marie found it. He left Montreal on April 21st, 1668. Under his direction, a stockaded house and chapel were erected as the first Jesuit mission on this historic spot. A year later, Marquette was replaced by Father Claude Dablon, an able and energetic man who accomplished much during his tenure of office. In a letter which he wrote to the Jesuit Superior General, we have our first good description of Sault-Ste. Marie. What is commonly called the Sault is not properly a salt or a very high waterfall, but a very violent current of waters from Lake Superior, which, finding themselves checked by a great number of rocks that dispute their passage, form a dangerous cascade of half a league in width, all these waters descending and plunging headlong together, as if a flight of stairs, over the rocks which bar the whole river. It is 3 leagues below Lake Superior, and 12 leagues above the Lake of the Hurons, this entire extent making a beautiful river cut by many islands, which divide it and increase its width in some places so that the eye cannot reach across. It flows very gently through almost its entire course, being difficult of passage only at the Sault. It is at the foot of these rapids, and even amid these boiling waters, that extensive fishing is carried on from spring until winter of a kind of fish found usually only in Lake Superior and Lake Huron. It is called in the native language Atacameg, and in ours whitefish, because in truth it is very white. And it is most excellent, so that it furnishes food almost by itself to the greater part of these peoples. This convenience of having fish in such quantities that one has only to go and draw them out of the water attracts the surrounding nations to the spot during the summer. These people, being wanderers, without fields and without corn, and living for the most part only by fishing, find here the means to satisfy their wants, and at the same time we embrace the opportunity to instruct them and train them in Christianity during their sojourn in this place. Therefore, we have been obliged to establish here a permanent mission, which is the center for the others, as we are here surrounded by different nations, of which the following are those who sustain relations to the place, repairing hither to live on its fish. The principal and native inhabitants of this district are those who call themselves Pahuidingwak Irini, because it is they who live at the Sault as in their own country, the others being there only as borrowers. They comprise only 150 souls, but have united themselves with 3 other nations which number more than 500. And 50 persons, to whom they have, as it were, made a cession of the rights of their native country, and so these live here permanently, except the time when they are out hunting. Next come those who are called the Nuke, who extend toward the south of Lake Superior, whence they take their origin, and the Outchibus, together with the Marameg, toward the north of the same lake, which region they regard as their own proper country. Besides these 4 nations, there are 7 others dependent on this mission. The people called Achiliguian, the Amakuras, and the Mississauga fish here, and hunt on the islands, and in the regions round about Lake Huron. They number more than 400 souls. 2 other nations, to the number of 500 souls entirely nomadic, and with no fixed abode, go toward the lands of the north to hunt during the winter, and return hither to fish during the summer. There remain 6 other nations, who are either people from the North Sea, as the Kilistinons and the Ovenibigonk, or wanderers in the regions around that same North Sea, the greater part of them having been driven out of their country by famine, and repairing hither from time to time to enjoy the abundance of fish here. The nomadic life led by the greater part of the savages of these countries lengthens the process of their conversion, and leaves them only a very little time for receiving the instruction that we give them. To render them more stationary, we have fixed our abode here, where we cause the soil to be tilled, in order to induce them by our example to do the same, and in this several have already begun to imitate us. Moreover, we have had a chapel erected, and have taken care to adorn it, going farther in this than one would dare promise himself in a country so destitute of all things. We there administer baptism to children as well as adults with all the ceremonies of the Church, and admonish the new Christians during the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The old men attend on certain days to hear the word of God, and the children gather there every day to learn the prayers and the catechism. Sault-Ste. Marie was the very heart of the Great Lakes region and the point of assembly of many Indian tribes. It is no wonder, then, that the Jesuits made it their strategic base of operations. Father Dablon, soon after his arrival, appealed to his superior for more priests to help in the work of evangelization. The task was too formidable for him to take care of, single-handed. The appeal was answered in the persons of Father Gabriel Druletz and Father Louis André, who came early in 1670. The latter was sent immediately to the Algonquins and spent a 2-year sojourn among them. Father Druletz was kept at the Sault, where he won his way into the hearts of the savages by his tireless devotion during a severe plague which had broken out among them. That same year, 2 other priests, members of the Society of Saint Sulpice, put in their appearance at Sault-Ste. Marie. They were Fathers François Dollier de Casson and René de Bréhaut de Galinée, and they came uninvited. Originally, they had been with the expedition of La Salle, but when that party broke up, they pushed on alone to the Sault. Their stay at the Jesuit mission house was a short one, for though they were cordially treated, it was made plain to them that they were not needed at the mission. While life at the Sault was never dull, few happenings there could compete with the colorful pageantry witnessed on June 14, 1671. The occasion was one of those grandiose displays of patriotism. Perhaps nationalism would more accurately cover the situation by which an explorer formally took possession of an unknown and uncivilized land in the name of his monarch. In the present instance, a claim was staked for France to the whole of interior North America, including the entire Great Lakes region with its rich mineral deposits then already in the process of discovery. The king's agent in New France, known as the Intendant, Monsieur Talon, had received instructions from His Most Christian Majesty to exert himself strenuously for the establishment of Christianity here by aiding the missions, and to cause the name and sovereignty of the monarch to be acknowledged by, or even the least known and most remote nations. Talon commissioned a young French nobleman, François Daumont, Sieur de Saint-Lusson, to execute the royal order and to take possession, in the name of the Sun King, Louis XIV, of the territories lying between the east and the west from Montreal as far as the South Sea, covering the utmost extent and range possible. 10. The modern reader may well smile at the egotism implied in such a pompous command, but it was typical of an age which had a flair for such showmanship, designed to exalt the name and power of the monarch in the eyes of his children of the forest across the sea. However, there was more to these. Ceremonies then met the eye. Ever present, if only in the background, was the idea of getting an edge on a rival nation. But such a motive as material gain for one's country had not the proper respectable sound. Hence it was cleverly camouflaged in terms of the highest altruism, purportedly concerned with the interests of religion and the welfare of the native. In the case under consideration, the prise de possession was intended to make up for the loss which France had sustained a decade before in the defection of Groseilliers and Radisson to the English. The 2 men, brothers-in-law, were experienced voyageurs and knew the Indians as few did. The shrewdness with which they handled the red man paid them rich dividends, for they succeeded in building up a fabulous trade in pelts. One time they even saved New France from economic ruin by arriving at Quebec opportunely with their cargo of furs. However, like most men who live close to nature, they were possessed of an intensely independent temperament. In dealing with their less hardy fellow men, they made the terms, and no one not. Even the governor of New France, as he learned from experience, could dictate to them. When the latter wished to send his agents with the 2 men on their journey into the fur country, he was flatly refused. From that time on, they were given a cool reception whenever they presented themselves at the governor's house. Even their proposal to take over the route which led to the great storehouse of furs north and west of Lake Superior by way of Hudson Bay, a plan which, if carried out, would have served the best interests of France, was turned down. In the face of these rebuffs, Groseilliers and Radisson offered their valuable information and experience to England. The offer was eagerly accepted, and the result was the establishment of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670. This was a serious blow to the French, and it was to prevent an encirclement of their empire in the New World by the English stemming from Hudson Bay, that Talon proposed laying formal claim to the heart of the continent. Colbert, Louis XIV's finance minister, was opposed to the idea in the beginning, but quickly gave his assent when he learned of the rich copper and iron deposits to be found around Lake Superior. In her book, Lake Superior, Grace Lee Newt describes the picturesque ceremony that took place in Sault's day. Marie, when de Saint-Lusson claimed a continent for his king. The ceremony took place on the southwest shore of the rapids near the palisaded mission and the native village. The gates of the mission opened, and out came black-robed Jesuits, traders in gay sashes, Perrault the interpreter, and de Saint-Lusson, the personal representative of the king, in the bright uniform of a French officer. From his helmet fluttered the royal ensign, gold lilies on a field of white. The priest's crucifixes were held aloft as a Latin hymn was sung en route to the little hill where the Indians stood impassive in all the finery, beloved of them. De Saint-Lusson beckoned the natives to approach. Perrault interpreted, telling them that the great Father beyond the sea was now their Father and that he had sent them tokens of his concern for them. At this point, bales of presents were opened and distributed among the Indians. In return, they presented the king with furs. Then the standard bearing the royal arms was set up, while the Exaudiat was sung and Latin prayers were chanted. Finally, as part of an old feudal custom, de Saint-Lusson bent, broke off a bit of sod, and holding it aloft proclaimed in a loud voice, "In the name of the Most High, Most Mighty, and most redoubtable monarch Louis XIV, most Christian king of France and Navarre, we take possession of the said place Sainte Marie du Sol, as also of Lake Huron and Superior, the island of Manitoulin, and all the other countries, rivers, lakes, and their tributaries contiguous and adjacent thereto, those discovered and to be discovered, bounded on one side by the northern and western seas, and on the other by the South Sea. This land in all its length and breadth." All this he repeated 3 times, while the French priests and traders exclaimed, "Vive le roi!" and the traders and Indians shot off their muskets. The chiefs signed the record, as did 4 missionaries and 14 traders. The grand old hymn Vexilla Regis, chanted at the close of these performances, ended this stirring and symbolic ceremony, the first of many similar events in various parts of the continent. The Jesuit priests who witnessed the ceremony were Gabriel Drulettes, who had succeeded Dablon as superior at the Sault, Claude Dablon, Claude Allouez, and Louis André. With the close of the celebrations, all but Drulettes returned to their own missions. The Indians, too, departed for their villages, deeply impressed by the pomp and power their French brothers had displayed. All in all, it had been a red-letter day. The Jesuits continued to staff the mission at the Sault for the next quarter century. Of all who held the post of superior, and these included such men as Henri Nouvel, Pierre Béoquet, and Charles Albanel, Father Drulettes was the most successful. His zeal was insatiable, and he literally spent himself in the service of the savages. Shea writes of him, "Drulettes, full of sanctity and zeal, soon changed the Sault. The cures he effected during an epidemic were regarded as miraculous, and the Indians in a general council, on the October 11th, 1670, declared the Sault to be Christian and adopted the God of the prayer as the master of life. The chiefs came to the chapel for instruction. The young cried out, 'The Sault prays, the Sault is Christian.' All was now in motion, the minds were open. To light the hearts to grace, in 6 months, 120 children were baptized, and when in January 1671, the church and mission house were destroyed by fire, Drulettes, who had saved nothing but the Blessed Sacrament, began to erect a new and finer one. Within the year, he baptized 300 souls, but Drulettes was not only a most successful missionary and able counselor, he was, in the eyes of his contemporaries, a saint. The mission was abandoned shortly after the death, on January 11, 1696, of Charles Albanel, its last incumbent. This venerable missionary saw most of the labors of his confreres come to naught. Bloody wars among the savages and the liquor traffic were largely responsible for this turn of events. During the next 3 decades, Sault Ste. Marie was hardly more than a name on the map. A few Indian lodges were still to be found, on the shore near the rapids, and perhaps some 24 cabins occupied by French and English families. Missionaries, both Jesuits and others, passed through the salt coming and going from their posts, but none seems to have considered the place important enough to revive the mission. Occasionally one of them would stop to say a mass and hear the confessions of the few people living there. On October 15, 1815, a Father Dumoulin baptized a young lady named Elizabeth, 21 years of age, and the wife of a Francis Lalande. In the summer of 1820, Henry R. Schoolcraft, explorer and mineralogist, visited the Salt, which he describes thus in his journal: the village of the Sault d'Este. Marie is on the south or American shore and consists of from 15 to 20 buildings occupied by 5 or 6 French and English families. The site of the village is elevated and pleasant, and a regular plan appears to have been observed in the buildings, though some of them are in a state of dilapidation. And altogether it has the marks of an ancient settlement fallen to decay. Such indeed it is, having been settled by the French shortly after the occupation of Old Mackinac, and it continued for a long time the site of a French fort and Jesuit mission. Charlevoix in 1721 speaks of this mission as one of no recent date, and Henry in 1762 found here a stockaded fort with a small garrison under the command of a French national officer who was colloquially addressed by the title of governor. There were then 4 houses, 2 of which had been occupied as barracks, and the fort is described as seated on a beautiful plain of about 2 miles in circumference, and covered with luxuriant grass and within half a mile of the rapids. Although no vestiges of the old fort remain, this description of the site is perfectly accurate at the present moment. It has always been the residence of Indian tribes, who are drawn to this spot in great numbers by the advantage of taking the whitefish, which are very abundant at the foot of the rapid. There are at present about 40 lodges of Chippewa Indians, containing a population of about 200 souls, who subsist wholly upon the whitefish. Francis Vincent Badin, Samuel Mazzucchelli, Frederick Paraga, all priests who made a name for themselves in the pages of American Catholic history, visited Sault Ste. Marie periodically until Bishop Rees, under whose jurisdiction it fell after it passed into American hands, appointed Father Francis Hatcher, CSS, its first pastor under the new regime. He experienced the immediate goodwill of the people, both Catholic and Protestant, who rendered him every assistance in building a small log chapel to take care of the needs of the community. However, this led to difficulties, for it antagonized the 2 resident preachers, Baptist and Methodist. Hardly had the chapel been dedicated to divine service when, at their instigation, the building was wrecked one night, and after that damage had been repaired, it was burned to the ground. Of this bigoted act, Bishop Rees wrote to the directors of the Leopoldine Association. And yet all this crying need of books for the Indians, etc., would be easier to contend with than the base persecutions which we have to suffer in many places of my diocese, from people who call themselves Christians. I can only mention with tears the contemptible vandalism perpetrated on our little chapel at Sault Ste. Marie. The windows were smashed, the sacred vessels and vestments thrown out, crushed and destroyed, the missal torn into 1,000 fragments, and, after the good Father Hatcher, without a word of complaint, on the eve of All Saints, repaired the damage as best he could, the whole building was set on fire. The loss is for us incalculable, inasmuch as it is very difficult to obtain here utensils which we so indispensably need. The affair has unexpectedly turned out in our favor. The Baptist and Methodist preachers were compelled to seek safety in flight to escape the vengeance of an angry people who now all sympathize with us. Thus, a temporal loss and persecution has brought us much spiritual consolation. The last baptism recorded by Father Hatcher is under the date of April 15, 1836. That spring he left for Ohio, where his order was opening new missions. During the summer, a Father Jean-Baptiste Prou visited the mission. He performed 5 baptisms on July 19, 1836. That fall, Father Pierce came on the scene. He found a settlement of 400 already baptized, but wholly neglected Christians, Canadians, Frenchmen, half-breeds, and Indians of the Chippewa Nation. What might have been, under more favorable circumstances, a good nucleus for a Christian community such as he had established at La Croix and in later years would establish at Arbre Croche, turned out to be a bitter disappointment. The majority of his new flock were Catholic in name only. While they gave him the same spirited welcome they had given each of his predecessors and showered him with attentions, they resisted his every effort to reclaim them to the practice of their faith. Even his sermons, in which he pleaded at first and finally threatened, had no effect upon them. They would listen to his words with an impassiveness that was maddening. When he finished speaking, they got up, shrugged their shoulders, and walked away. He had not been there many months before he decided to give up the work as a hopeless assignment. However, divine providence ruled otherwise, for the approach of winter prevented him from leaving the Sault. Forced to remain, he decided to make the most of a bad situation and so began to work with the children. Their response was quite different from their elders. They came eagerly to his cabin to learn the catechism and the simple prayers he taught them. Little by little, a change could be noticed in the attitude of some of their parents. They began to come to him shamefacedly and ask for instruction so that they would not be outdone by their children. It was a happy moment for Father Pierce, and before spring returned to the Sault, he had forgotten all intentions of leaving. His report to the Leopoldine Association reflects his joy at this victory. Father Hatcher labored here in 1835 as the first resident missionary, and, notwithstanding his apostolic zeal, he could reach but few hearts. Discouraged, he shook the dust off his feet. I would have done the same had not Providence forestalled my retreat by the oncoming winter. Fully realizing my awkward position, I yet did not give it a forlorn hope, but resolved, since I had to stay, to commence my operations clean from the bottom, and so I started a school, inviting all the little ones to me in order that I might sow the word of God in their innocent hearts, all winter long. From morning till night, every day, was my dwelling filled with children, big and small. The parents, delighted with the quick progress in the schoolwork, were soon put to shame also by the devout recital of prayers by their own children, so that they too learned to pray, to come to Mass, and to listen to my instruction. I often had the pleasure of receiving the first confession of children, parents, and grandparents at the same time, and was moved many a time unto tears by the first Holy Communion of adult Catholics, or the solemn profession of faith of converted Protestants. Thus, my first desolation has turned into solace. Once having interested the adults in the practice of their ancient faith, Father Pierce had all he could do to take care of their needs. He had to postpone to a later date his original intention of making Sault stay. Marie another one of his bases of operation and going out from it to the more distant Indian villages in that area. Years of neglect had thoroughly inured the inhabitants to a pagan way of life. Drunkenness, immodest dancing, foul language, and all the other vices of immoral living made the work of their reconversion a formidable challenge. But he succeeded. By working with the children, he soon found his way into the hearts of the adults. The first parochial school at the Sault, which Father Pierce enjoys the distinction of having founded, was opened in his own dwelling shortly after his arrival. Spring found him erecting a modest church, the original building having fallen completely into ruin. The structure, measuring about 45 by 75 feet, was of unique construction, for he had devised a method to circumvent the poverty of his mission. With only a minimum of money to work with, he had to rule out the possibility of using boards exclusively in the construction of the church. Instead, he conceived the idea of a combination board and log. He set heavy timbered uprights, 4 to 5 feet apart, on a solid foundation of stone. These uprights were grooved from top to bottom to take square timbers of even size, also grooved. The two came together in dovetail fashion. The crevices were sealed with mud and the whole exterior covered with homemade clapboards. The inside was plastered and the ceiling was finished off to give it a vaulted appearance. To the rear of this rather impressive edifice, he added another substantial building of 5 rooms to serve as a school and as living quarters for himself. Bishop Rizet, who made a visitation of the mission in the summer of 1838, while Pierce was at La Pointe consulting with Father Baraga, was pleasantly surprised when he saw the new church. So marked was the contrast with the rundown appearance of the other buildings in the village that it looked even more imposing than it actually was in speaking to the people. He noted the progress that had been made among them since the arrival of Father Pierce, and complimented them for seeing to completion what he called one of the finest churches in the state. 22. The Bishop of Detroit could well afford to be generous in his praise of Pierce's achievements at Sault Ste. Marie. The latter had rendered a notable service in reviving this moribund mission and reclaiming its inhabitants from their religious indifference. He had replaced the old dilapidated church in use during the French regime with a new one of comfortable dimensions. Yet, during the whole time that the new church was under construction and Pierce was weighed down with money problems, Risse manifested no great concern in the matter, as far as one can. Gathered from the missionary's correspondence, the bishop apparently ignored Pierce's constant pleas for financial assistance, sometimes not even forwarding to him what the latter might in all justice have expected. It was a strange character trait in a bishop, that of almost total obliviousness to the problems and financial difficulties of his priests. When he appointed Father Pierce to take charge of the mission at Sault Ste. Marie, Bishop Risse gave his word that he himself would personally assume responsibility for the old church debt owed to Gabriel Francher, agent of the American Fur Company. On the strength of this promise, the missionary had proceeded with the construction of his new church, the cost of which was to be defrayed by voluntary subscriptions. It did not take long for him to discover that Bishop Risse had done nothing about the old debt. Agents of the American Fur Company plagued him daily to pay what was due them. To add to his worries, many of the subscription pledges were not redeemed. At a loss as to what to do, Pierce put $60 of his own money into the project to help relieve the acute financial situation. A crisis was reached when Francher boldly took upon himself the management of the parish finances to make certain that, if anyone was to suffer a loss, it would not be the American Fur Company. Father Pierce was thoroughly aroused by these tactics and wrote a strong letter to Risse, informing him of what had taken place and blaming him for all his present misfortunes. He reproached the prelate for having gone back on his word and added the reminder that he possessed a written statement signed by Risse to the effect that he was to receive $200 a year for his mission, but so far had not received 1 cent. He declared himself to be even more pained at receiving no acknowledgement of the many letters sent to the bishop, nor of his reports about his work. Very bluntly, he announced that he intended to leave Risse's service in the spring. He could not, he wrote, live on empty promises. The hopeless state of affairs at the Sault warranted the strong language used by the missionary. The American Fur Company, which enjoyed an exclusive trade monopoly in this territory by an act of Congress, had no sympathy for Pierce's financial problems. Their concern was to get back as much as they could of the money owed them. The methods which their agents employed to achieve this were of no particular interest to them. Francher, acting for the company, canvassed the parishioners and collected what he could from each, applying this to the debt. To pay off the new debt which was mounting, he took over the missionary's potato crop, some 171 bushels, for which he paid a paltry 97 cents a bushel. Pierce was helpless in the face of such ruthlessness. Although done under color of exacting justice, it was nothing more than an unscrupulous attempt aimed at impoverishing the priest and thwarting his efforts to civilize and Christianize the savage. In this way, the American Fur Company could keep the Indian in subjection and exploit him for their own selfish ends. While there was nothing that Pierce could do to outwit them, he could speak up and let them know his mind. Openly he called them robbers and scoundrels. He accused them of reducing him to a miserable state of poverty, and even of poisoning his cow in order to drive him out. All he had left in the way of supplies to see him through the winter being 2 pounds of butter, 2 pounds of bacon, and a little flour. It is no wonder, then, that Sault Ste. Marie never had any real hold on Father Pierce. He did not regard it with the same affection that he had for some of the other missions in which he worked. No doubt he never quite overcame the initial disgust he experienced when he came there in 1836 and saw for himself the depths of moral depravity into which those of his flock had fallen. The extreme poverty of the place made it even less desirable in his eyes. His parishioners were of the poorest, and many of them were completely shiftless. The Indians subsisted almost exclusively on a diet of fish. He himself was no better off. He had come to the salt with little more than the clothes on his back and the few essential items he required in order to function as a priest. He offered Mass on a common table with a plain linen napkin serving as an altar cloth. His vestments were shabby and patched, and his chalice was of brass. He never received the church goods and personal belongings which he had shipped to himself via Trieste on setting out for America. When word finally reached him at Salt's Day, Marie, that they had all been destroyed in a fire at the warehouse in New York, he was disconsolate. Hoping to get at least partial compensation for the loss, he investigated further, only to receive a letter from a Mr. Kruger, a New York merchant, informing him that his effects had not burned but had been sent to him according to instructions on October 22, 1835, in care of Bishop Rice. A letter of inquiry to the bishop brought the answer that they evidently had never reached Detroit. This was a serious loss to suffer at the outset of his missionary career, and Piers was determined to get to the bottom of the whole mystery. He asked Rees for permission to leave his post temporarily, so that he could look into the matter personally. It was worthwhile, he told the prelate, to spend money and time for this, because everything that he possessed in the world was included in the shipment. Although he left no stone unturned, he never succeeded in tracing the mission goods. However, the loss was in part made up by his friends in Carniola. From them he received new supplies of clothing, books, vestments, seeds, etc. Firmly convinced that much of the poverty at the Salt was the result of the indolence of its inhabitants, he decided soon after his arrival to give them a lesson in industry and initiative. He planted 3 model gardens with a variety of vegetables such as they had never seen before. He selected especially those that would thrive in the soil of the region. He also set out a small nursery with cuts of apple and pear trees. By the following spring, he was able to distribute little fruit trees about a foot high to the Indians, most of whom have never seen any fruit from trees. For within a radius of more than 100 miles from here, there is not a single fruit tree. The experiment worked, for the people showed a remarkable interest in gardening, many of them imitating Piers and planting their own gardens. Since the only vegetable known to them was the potato, they were surprised when he told them of the many European orchard and garden products. He wrote that they gratefully accept all instructions in agriculture. Last year they could not await the ripening of my garden produce. With my permission, they ate them raw and appreciated them as special delicacies. Later that same year, he expanded his garden into a model farm with the help of iron implements received from Europe. The Indians lent him a willing hand in this project, and under his direction planted field after field of corn and other vegetables. It was not until his second year at the Salt that Father Piers found it possible to resume his missionary journeys. His first was to a place that he calls Camp Mont d'Or, a distance of about 30 miles from his mission. A small band of pagan Indians lived here, and he stayed with them long enough to convert the chief, Kikon by name, and most of his subjects. To celebrate the occasion of his baptism, Kikon gave a banquet for his people with the missionary as his guest of honor. Piers writes of it in some detail for the benefit of his readers. It was served in a large room of his home, hung with artistically plaited and variegated mats of cedar bark withes. Many dishes, such as doe, bear shoulders, otter, wild cats, pheasants, and rabbits, also many varieties of fish and pastry in wooden dishes, had been placed on the floor in 2 rows along the room. Tables and chairs were conspicuously absent. The men squatted down on the one side to the row of food, the women on the other. The guests came, and after the table prayers had been said, and the food blessed in Christian fashion, all partook of the viands by aid of their hands and a pocket knife. I sat down on a small box, covered with a red cloth, evidently the place of honor, with a plate on my knee and provided with a knife and fork. The chief sat at my side. We dined very comfortably and drank tea or coffee, sweetened with maple sugar from white tin cups, whatever beverage was preferred. After the customary prayer of thanksgiving, some beautiful Indian church hymns were sung. In conclusion, the chief addressed me and the other guests in a touching speech, to which I replied in an impressive manner. Finally, we rested comfortably in front of the house, in the place where the council meetings are held. Meanwhile, the young folk of the village had arrived and joyfully consumed what the guests had left. Finally, all returned to their lodges in happy contentment. The circumstances connected with this incident differ so. Slightly from another reported to the Leopoldine Association, which is supposed to have taken place at about the same time, that the writer is of the opinion that the two are identical. A possible explanation for such discrepancies as are apparent is that one was written shortly after it occurred, while the other, the account just quoted, not until many years later. Pierce was already a very old man by that time, and his memory may not have been too reliable. The incident of which he wrote to Vienna took place during his journey to a place called Kichimitigong. He made a convert of the chief of the tribe, an old man of 70, who gave a feast to show his appreciation for the gift of faith. Pierce writes this account. The religious ceremony was followed toward evening by a bountiful repast, which was appreciated because we were all still fasting. This was the first opportunity I had the honor to preside at an Indian banquet. There were no table, no chairs, no wine, no soup, no spoons, and no particular etiquette to follow. On the ground were spread out ingeniously woven mats, and upon them were served in courses, on large wooden plates, the choicest of fish, game, and fowl, rounded out with 2 quarters of bear. The natives sat on the mat while the chief and I assumed American manners. We had each a chair, a plate on our knees, a fork, and a knife. The clear lake water replaced the wine list. That same summer, Pierce also visited a small Indian settlement of about 50 souls on St. Joseph Island in the North Channel, just south of Solstad. Marie. Here he received a disappointment. When he had almost all the men ready for the reception of baptism, a white trader lured them away from the island with promises of whiskey. Pierce baptized only 3 persons on this trip, since the women and children were not allowed to do anything without the permission of the men. Later, however, many of the men came all the way to the salt to beg him to finish instructing them and to baptize them. The early part of June, 1838, found him on his way to Michipicoten on the north shore of Lake Superior. He made the trip in a boat manned by 4 guides. Throughout the journey, he evinced a lively interest in his surroundings. The tremendous expanse of Lake Superior, which he described as the wildest and largest in the world, more than 200 German miles long and 150 wide, and ordinarily harassed like the ocean by constant storms, impressed him. He noted the poorness of the land surrounding it, a chain of low rocky hills, a dismal desert, inhabited only at times by a few fishermen. He was fascinated by the variety of stone which he saw: granite, quartz, limestone, flint, and marble, the latter black and red with conical stripes, brightly polished to a height of 60 feet by the constant friction of the waves, reflecting the light from their wondrously beautiful walls. These rocks engirdle the lake with a sheen of pure delight. 34. He saw evidences of iron and copper ore. In places he even glimpsed pure copper jutting out of rifts in the rocks. A vivid imagination only increased the pleasure he derived from observing these wonders of nature. One of his letters contains the following description. With the aid of my ever-eager fancy, I discovered 3 remarkable oddities of nature in this world of rocks. Against a marvelous wall of marble, I found a beautiful cross, formed by nature, 6 feet below the surface, in water as clear as crystal. It is of white marble against a black background, both polished by the churning of the waves. The length is 12 feet, the breadth 6, while the beams are approximately 1/2 feet wide, the formation being marvelously accurate. In another place I discovered a white enamel-like inset, representing very plainly a sorrowing knight, leaning against a black rock wall. At the mouth of Michipicoten Bay, which has a length of some 15 hours and width of 10, there is a small island of rock, the stone peak of which represents a man seated, whose entire head is so naturally formed that the Indians assert the figure was once a man who had been punished by the Great Spirit by being converted into stone. A painter could find here the most striking scenes for his brush. Nature, however, was not all delight. Pierce had cause to complain about the fierceness of the mosquitoes and the gnats, and the destructiveness of rats. The former, he wrote to a friend, are a general plague in America. Their poisonous sting causes excessive itching pains and swellings, and sometimes brings death to man and beast. In spite of the fact that he wore a netting over his head, it was impossible to avoid them entirely. Gnats, which the English call sandflies and the French moustiques de sabre, were even more bothersome. The missionary suffered 2 gnat stings on his ears and on his hands, and the following morning his ears had swollen to the thickness of fists, and the hands and forearms were greatly enlarged as far as the elbows. During their last night in camp, just 20 miles from their destination, they were visited by a pack of rats as large as cats. The rodents devoured whatever food they could find and chewed up shoes and clothing. Since Pierce could not sleep on account of the hardness of the rocky beach, he spent the night chasing away the marauders. In the morning, believing that his belongings had not suffered, he laughed heartily over the misfortunes of his guides, who were gloomily taking inventory of their losses. However, when one of them showed Pierce his cassock, of which a full 8 inches had been chewed away, he quickly joined the chorus of complaint. Before leaving the unhappy place, they christened it Campement des Rats, Rat Camp. Fortunately, a favorable wind gave all of them ample time to mend their clothes while sailing. At Michipicoten, Father Pierce was warmly received into the home of the agent of the Hudson's Bay Company. John D. Cameron, although a Protestant, was extremely cordial to the missionary and invited him to share his table. The Indians of this place were poor in worldly goods because they were so far removed from civilization. They possessed nothing whatsoever except their bark tents, a pot for cooking and a pot hook, a gun or bow and arrows, and a fish hook or 2. Father Pierce continues, their only food is fish and game, and often these are lacking. The men cover themselves with only a blanket wear, no trousers, no foot or head covering. The women, however, are very modestly dressed in black linen or other coarse cloth, while the children generally run about half-naked. The Indians of Michipicoten were receptive to his message, and before he left there he baptized many of them. Moved by their poverty, he also gave them such little gifts as he could. Through the generous benefactions of friends in Europe like Ferdinand Schmidt, a merchant of Schischka, a suburb of Laibach, and Canon Pauscheg, a member of the cathedral chapter. Further up on the north shore was the Indian village of Oquanokisinong. Pierce spells it Oquayanakisinong. This was his next port of call, and here he converted the whole tribe as a group. Even the 2 men who tried to escape by boat to another island in order to avoid hearing his sermons were driven back by a sudden storm, and taking this as a divine omen, begged to receive the saving waters of baptism. He describes the ceremony with deep emotion. The savages ranged themselves according to age along the lakefront, on the white sand, and knelt to receive baptism. I administered the sacrament with a heart throbbing with joy, baptizing all on one day, leaving the children for the evening when I had light in my tent. On this day, June 21st, which I shall never forget, I was repeatedly moved to tears of joy, particularly when, at sundown, tired from my labors for the Lord, I cast a contemplative look around me. To the left lay the lake in rare calmness. The sun, growing reddish and seeming to dip into the water, covered the surface with a glorious golden glow and produced a reflection like to a large, beautiful 7-colored rainbow. To the right I saw the pious group of my black-haired children born in Christ, in the background the green Indian desert, and above it all the beautiful blue vault of heaven, a splendid temple of God, the admirable handiwork of the dear Creator. I would not have bartered the joy and comfort the Lord permitted my heart and soul to garner that day for all the glory of the throne of Solomon. Father Pierce returned to Sault Ste. Marie in the early summer of 1838. His provisions had given out, and the cost of maintaining his 4 guides prompted him to cut short this missionary journey. Before taking leave of his converts, he promised that as soon as his means would permit, he would send them an Indian catechist to continue their instruction. His sojourn at the Sault was a short one, just long enough to allow him to get a change of linen. He found awaiting him a letter from Father Baraga, whom Rees had appointed one of his vicars general responsible for that part of the diocese within the boundaries of the territory of Wisconsin, summoning him to La Pointe for a conference. Deeming it prudent to be prepared for any eventuality, he packed his few belongings and bade farewell to his people. He went by trading vessel to La Pointe, on Madeline Island, situated at the western end of Lake Superior. He arrived on June 13, 1838, and as he climbed from the little boat that had brought him to the dock, he was warmly embraced by his compatriot and fellow priest, Frederick Baraga. It was their first meeting, and the moment was one of supreme joy to both. A strong bond of affection already existed between them, for Providence had inextricably linked the destinies of the two priests. The younger Baraga having been the inspiration for the older Piers to dedicate his remaining years to the missionary apostolate. Standing quietly beside her brother, but just as eager to greet him, was Baraga's youngest sister, the widowed Antonia von Hofern, who had come to America in 1837 to assist her brother in his work. How long Piers remained at La Pointe is not clear from his correspondence, except that it must have been more than a week. The two men spent much of their time exchanging ideas that might be of mutual benefit and in drawing up plans for the expansion of their field in the immediate future. Piers was especially eager to learn whatever he could of the methods employed by the more experienced missionary. To him, the name of Baraga was synonymous with all that spelled success in mission work. He wrote the following to a sister of Baraga who was living in the family castle. Anxious to learn what I could, I cast a searching glance over everything to be seen. The Catholic congregation here. It is very numerous, consisting chiefly of Indians and half-breeds, all of whom are children, born in Christ, of Fr. Baraga. They fill the church daily, conducting themselves devoutly, and there, besides saying their morning prayers and attending Holy Mass, they also each day receive public instructions. Sundays, however, Fr. Baraga preaches in French, English, and Indian, since there are some French Canadians and a few Englishmen here. Even now, every Sunday a few heathens are baptized, whom the Good Shepherd seeks out daily in their huts and instructs. His untiring zeal is praiseworthy, and he is indeed spoken of everywhere in glowing terms. He is undoubtedly the most pious priest and the best missioner in India. Entirely different, however, was his opinion of Baraga as a manager of the temporal affairs of the mission. In this, Pierce considered himself the superior. He suffered no embarrassment whatever in telling Baraga of his shortcomings. Indeed, he saw it as a fraternal duty to chide him gently for his mismanagement. Pierce submitted various plans to assure subsistence for the missioner and improvement of the temporal condition of the poor mission congregation. 44. Yet he did not expect any real improvement. The basic reason for Baraga's extreme poverty was not any defect of character. Her brother's boundless generosity, wrote Pierce to Baraga's sister, will always preserve him in apostolic poverty. The saintly missionary's philosophy of life was that of a man of God who did not worry unduly about the needs of tomorrow, firmly trusting that a benevolent providence would assure him and those he loved their daily bread. Pierce, whose own view on such matters was more practical, was oftentimes exasperated by the course of action his confrere would suggest in meeting a problem. In fact, he confesses that, at least jokingly, they tried to reconcile his too spiritual and my still worldly attitude. Hoa dec. Pierce meets Baraga and his sister Antonia at La Pointe. Baraga's sister Antonia, who was his housekeeper, had a down-to-earth attitude that Pierce could understand. He was favorably impressed by the way in which this lady of refinement had adapted herself to the American way of life. She had come to live with her brother, with the idea of being a help to him. For this reason, she had spent several months in a convent, in Paris, learning French, so that she could teach catechism to the children of La Pointe. Antonia made up for any lack of realism which her brother may have had in dealing with worldly affairs. Their little establishment, comments Pierce, consists of 2 oxen, 2 good cows, 6 chickens, a cat, and no mouse. But even this good lady could not meet the exacting standards set by Pierce, especially in matters of gardening. He regarded with scorn the American methods she had adopted, was shocked to see the potato patch so overgrown with weeds that no plants were visible, and was downright dismayed to note that the quantities of apple tree shoots he had sent to Baraga had dwindled to a mere dozen, which Antonia kept in jars in the kitchen because of the extreme cold. The meeting of the two missionaries was a healthful tonic for both of them, as also for Baraga's sister. The opportunity of visiting with their own kind did not often present itself, and consequently, when it did, they made the most of it. Before leave-taking, it was decided that Piers should not return to Sault Ste. Marie, but should proceed farther west to establish a new mission at Grand Portage. Baraga had had a delegation from the chief of the Indians living at this busy trading post begging him to send them a missionary, for whom they had already built a small dwelling and a chapel of bark. Favorably impressed with what his confrere had already accomplished at La Croix and Sault Ste. Marie, Baraga knew that he could find no one better qualified to make this new foundation.